now move on to our next session, which is a special session on Indian strategic culture. Joining us for this enlightening panel discussion, moderated by Major General D.K. Sharma, Adivashish Seva Medal, Sena Medal and Bar, Director General USI, on the evolving nature of India's strategic culture, including how our timeless ancient strategic wisdom continues to shape our diplomatic and national security approach. Both our distinguished panelists share their individual insight about what drives India's brand of diplomacy. An exploration of this topic into the past, present, and future, along with bridging the gap between theoretical frameworks and rare politics, make this fascinating discussion all the more worthwhile. Don't miss this exciting opportunity to understand what forms the fulcrum of India's foreign policy and statecraft on the global stage. I welcome Dr. Kashmi Kamal and request her to please join us on stage. Dr. Kashmi Kamal is an associate professor at Takshina Institution, Bangalore. She has designed the course curriculum and teaches Kautilya's Arthashastra through webinars and contact workshops. Her research focuses on the concept of strategic culture in the Indian context. She is a graduate in history from Lady Shri Ram College and a postgraduate in international relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has received her doctoral degree from the University of Hyderabad. Her PhD thesis is titled Kautilya's Arthashastra and India's Strategic Culture, a comparative study of two phases of India's foreign policy, 1947-1964 and 1998 to 2014, reflects the convergence of her interest in ancient historical texts and contemporary strategic studies. Dr. Kamal is a regular guest speaker at premier defense institutions like the National Defense College, Naval War College, Defense Services Staff College, and College of Defense Management. She also writes regularly for several online platforms like The Wire, The Print, Observer Researcher Foundation, USI, and the Chanakya Forum. Her book on Kautilya's Arthashastra and India's contemporary statecraft was published globally in August 2022. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Srikanth. Dr. Srikanth retired as professor and head from the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies and Director Yashwantrao Chavan National Center for International Security and Defense Analysis, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. He is a member of Editorial Advisory Board, South African Journal of Military Studies, a visiting faculty member at Maharashtra Intelligence Academy, Pune, and member of the Executive Committee. He was a research fellow, Center for Military Studies, Faculty for Military Science. Faculty for Military Science, University of Cape Town, a Jawaharlal Nehru National Fellow, a Fulbright Fellow at the George Washington University, Washington DC, and a visiting professor at Colorado College, Colorado Springs. He has published several books and articles in the area of security studies and international relations. We have Major General V.K. Sharma, AVSM, SMN Bar, DG USI with us to moderate this session. Major General V.K. Sharma is the Director of United Service Institution of India, India's oldest think tank established by the British in 1870. He was conferred 3 military awards by the President of India for rendering exceptional distinguished national service and for displaying exceptional courage. He was commissioned in the Siddharth Infantry Regiment in 1976 and superannuated in 2012. He specializes in strategic net assessment methodology, scenario building, and strategic gaming. He has visited about 35 countries as member of international delegations and on educational tours. He has participated in 29 international conferences abroad and several such conferences in India. He has edited about 8 books, contributed more than 60 seminal papers in the Indian foreign journals and newspapers, and presented 30 research papers at international conferences. He edits the prestigious USI Strategic To capture this moment, may I request for a group photograph, please?
Thank you, sir.
At the outset, I think as a Director General USI, I apologize on two counts. I think firstly, the sessions have been delayed. And secondly, I was blissfully under the impression that I'm chairing this session tomorrow evening. I just happened to be here incidentally and just I thought the session is today. So that shows that, well, there's been an information overload. But that notwithstanding, in the military we are trained for all kinds of contingencies. And so we will go ahead with the session. Now, there are two distinct parts to this session. And one is about India's strategic culture. In fact, we are very fortunate that Dr. Shrikant, Professor Shrikant, who is an eminent professor, has written a book which is the making of India's strategic culture, the making of national security policy, and there is this 2020 edition, which is very useful book. It's extremely, I would say, contextual, relevant to India's strategic security environment. And the book has about 7 chapters. It talks about strategic culture in the Indus Valley, then he comes to India since independence and looks at, the phase of national integration, Goa operations, Hyderabad, Kashmir, and then he talks about 47 to 91 era. Then it talks about post-99 era, and most of the major, what we call that policy, economic policy changes took place in that era when we became an open market economy. And then he looks at internal security and role of the state and beyond strategic autonomy in the modern era. And then he talks in the last chapter, India's strategic culture and national security policy. Now we know that in this country that there are 3 or 4 variations of different thoughts on India's strategic culture. One thought is that, well, we hardly have a strategic culture, and George Tannen, he wrote that something about maybe two decades ago, he wrote an essay, and then there was so much of discussion that India doesn't have a very well-defined strategic culture. Then there is another thing that, well, we're 5,000-year-old civilization and we are thriving and we fought so many wars and we conquered and we've been very successful in nation building and national integration. So India has its own version of its strategic culture. And the third thing was that, well, there is a strategic culture, but it is little bit diffused and it's not very well articulated. And so therefore, there has to be an institutionalized approach to India's strategic culture. How we do that, that's a debate. Now, so what I had a discussion with both my panelists, which is coming very handy today. So issues that I want to discuss with Professor Shrikant today, that if for our audience, you could just tell us what are the determinants of India's strategic culture and what are the major milestones in the evolution of India's strategic culture before I ask you the second question. Yeah. Or you want me to just say all questions and then, yeah. So this is the first question, ladies and gentlemen, that we will look at. Then the second question, we request the speaker to talk about how do we interpret India's strategic culture in the present environment. And the third issue is what is this prognosis of India's strategic culture in an era of contested world order, multipolarity, and there are so many conflicts which are taking place, and even our neighborhood is not very stable. And we have this what you call the collusive hybrid threat right in our own neighborhood, that is Pakistan and China. And this is totally interlinked with our own internal security problems, particularly in our border areas, border states. So with these three major issues, I request you for your initial presentation. Yes, wherever you would like.
Let me thank you, sir, for inviting me here to share some of my ideas and USA as an institution, and go straight away to the questions which you have raised. In fact, I'm grateful that we talked yesterday on these questions because it has helped me to structure what I'm going to talk about more effectively. Let me start with a core question in terms of why do nations behave as they do? Something which keeps coming up. The argument is that the behavior of nations is rooted in their strategic culture, and that is where I start. But I would argue that strategic culture is a product of nations' traditions, values, attitudes, patterns of behavior, habits, symbols, achievements, etc., and particular ways of adapting to the environment and solving problems with respect to the threat or a perceived threat or actual threat and a use of force. That is where I would put the whole concept of strategic culture. From where do we draw this? We draw it from the political culture of a country. It determines approaches to peace, approaches to security. It is a kind of a worldview, kind of an ideology of a country. This gained momentum basically during Cold War, that you have to understand Soviet behavior. In case of India, as Chairperson has just said, George Thanam forced Indians to think and rethink about what constitutes strategic culture. We are looking at Indian strategic thinking and Indian strategic culture. I would argue that it is a product of historical, cultural, geopolitical, socio-economic compulsions, and we have always talked of a civilizational mindset in terms of India. Look at some of the key phrases used to describe Indian strategic culture, typically over a period of time. Civilizational roots is something which is used. Assimilative culture, peace approach, independent understanding of world affairs, or in modern terminology, strategic autonomy, revisionism, anti-colonialism or anti-imperialism, depending on your ideological perspectives, pluralism, and finally abstract nature of way in which we project things, or what could be called deliberate ambiguity. Essentially what we are doing is, we create a kind of a governing image which is created in a sense deliberately, in a sense accidentally over a period of years, created by identifying, analyzing, interpreting history, culture, geography, and eventually articulating all of this. What do you depend upon? You depend upon a variety of writings, you depend upon a variety of situations, you depend upon the culture, you depend upon society, you spell out all of this in effect, and the effect on the Indian political, social issues, etc. Writings, when I'm talking of, you could have old British writings, romantic writings about India, you could have realistic writings about India, you have all levels of writings depending upon the ideological perceptions. I mean, you could name the creation of Asiatic society in terms of William Jones, or Basham, Wonder That Was India, or Max Muller, or you could talk of Jim Corbett, you could talk of Rudyard Kipling, E.M. Foster as some of the one area of that, or you could talk of R.C. Majumdar, you could talk of Pandit Nehru, you could talk of Ramchandra Guha, you could talk of Rabindranath Thapar, in terms of various perspectives and creating an image of India, creating a governing image. Let me come to the next question that you raised, evolution. How has it evolved? Let me submit that if you're looking at evolution, the way in which strategic culture has evolved in terms of the various narratives, and narratives is the most popular word that is used nowadays. Earlier it was paradigm, now it is narratives. If you're looking at various narratives, my submission is narratives which project Indian governing image have changed slightly in terms of degree, if not in substance, over a period of years. Let me illustrate what I'm saying. Look at narratives in terms of ancient and kind of medieval India. You're going to hear about Kautilya later. Essentially, the narrative was empire building, legitimacy of empire building, legitimacy for use of force for creating an empire. In international relations, you might talk of it a narrative which is realist. And you can talk of a variety of empires. You can talk of the Nandas, Mauryas, Guptas, Cholas, Pandyas, Ahom, or Rashtrakuts, or variety of them, Satvahans. Or medieval, you could talk of the Sikhs, the Marathas, Vijayanagar, Ahom, Rajputanas, etc. Use of force, military force, role of force was acceptable, legitimate, because you are talking of creating of empires. That was a kind of a narrative which existed. This narrative shifts during the freedom struggle, and it shifts in a very significant manner. Now, post-freedom struggle, post that period, when you talk of freedom struggle, the dominant mainstream narrative is peace approach, anti-colonialism. The interpretation of the freedom struggle is satyagraha, peace. Let me make a side comment. Look at any standard book on Indian national movement. It is 60 to 70% peaceful dimensions of struggles. Rest 30% would be the more violent struggles, whether it is or perceptions, whether it is Tilak or Bhagat Singh or Subhash Chandra Bose, 1857 uprising, even the naval mutiny of 1946 is almost not mentioned, because the dominant narrative is it is essentially Mahatma Gandhi, and whether it is school textbooks, whether it is books on Indian national movement, freedom struggle, that is the narrative which comes in. With that narrative comes certain symbols also. Ashoka is a symbol. We use Ashoka symbol in our as national symbol also. But Ashoka not pre-Kalinga, Ashoka post-Kalinga. Ashoka not as an empire builder in terms of Chandragupta Maurya and Bindusar. Ashoka as a post-Kalinga. That is the narrative that we have. That is the image that we are talking of. We use Bhishma's advice to Yudhishthir, Shanti Parva, in terms of welfare state, how the state should be. During that period, Kautilya was not mentioned much, because that goes into the realist school. The spread of, I'll give you another example. Cholas and Pandyas are hardly taught in the ancient Indian history. The official history of India, Gazetteer, Volume 2, talks of expansion, and the terminology used is spread of Indian culture was an intellectual conquest through peaceful means. Southeast Asia, intellectual conquest through peaceful means. That is the projection that is done. That is the kind of a dominant narrative that comes there. That narrative flows through, since pre-independence, post-independence, flows through almost until 1991. It is only post-91 that you have a shift in that narrative. 3 or 4 critical events took place, or defining events took place. One was economic liberalization. It was an ideological shift. You talk of structural adjustment, privatization, but you use the word economic liberalization. You do not use the word market economy, because we are a socialist country. We will say so. The economic liberalization gave us a different worldview, a different governing image. Nuclear test of 1998. we gave up deliberate ambiguity of 1974, that we have the capability but not the intent. And we spelled out the idea that we are a nuclear weapon power. That is a second. Indo-US nuclear deal. Deal per se is not important. It is not that suddenly Americans started to give us nuclear technology. No. But the deal opened up a lot of locks which were placed in India, on India because of 1974. We were able to take and have relations on nuclear issues with France, with Russia. Basically, the locks were opened because of the deal. And that, in a sense, spelled out an end of isolation. It also spelled out that now we are more open to a dialogue with the Americans, that ideological blinkers, leftist blinkers were given up. That was a change. And finally, look east. Obsession with West Asia ended. You have look east, you have act east, broadening of horizons basically. Given that, post 1990s, what are the critical issues which really we need to address as part of strategic culture? And that I'm flowing through the questions which you have raised, sir. One is legitimacy of the use of force, military force. How do we look at it? How have we been looking at it earlier, now, and in the future? Second is whether we follow a policy of revisionism or status quo. What is the kind of power that India has? Is it a revisionist power? Is it a status quoist power? Third is, what do we want? Do we want nuclear deterrence or do we want nuclear disarmament? And those are the debates. And finally, what utility does deliberate ambiguity have in Indian strategic thinking? Look at use of force. Look at the Nehru period. Nehru's answer to use of force was not that force was not necessary. He accepted it. But his answer to a question raised by Tibor Mende, the Hungarian journalist, as about use of force, etc., his answer was, why shout it out? Why talk of it all the time? Use it quietly. Indira Gandhi, 71, we used force. Use force if necessary. Use force basically because we have to use force because there is no other option, and therefore we used force. Vajpayee, we used force in Kargil, but there was a strategic restraint. Modi, for the first time we were saying that we will use force for national security purposes. Let me make a side comment, and I'm quite sure you'll be very critical of it. Right from 1947, whether it is Kashmir 1947, whether it is Goa, whether it is Hyderabad, whether it is 65, whether it is 71, or whether it is 62, and Kargil, use of force was done in an almost an apologetic manner in terms of the narratives which you were spelling out. We talked of media just now. It was almost in an apologetic manner, saying that we are forced to use it, whether it is for legal purposes in case of Kashmir, whether it is for humanitarian purposes in case of Bangladesh or whatever. For the first time during the Modi period, we were talking of use of force for national security purposes. It is our requirement and therefore we did it. Then whether it is hot pursuit in Myanmar, whether it is Balakot, Shumar, Demchok, Doklam, whatever, or Galwan. It is true that this is restricted to the southern Asian area. It is not global. It is true that they are restricted to there are limits. But for the first time we are talking of use of force basically for national security without being apologetic about it. Second, revisionism. Revisionism is something which we have been talking of right since the early times. Right? Our whole non-alignment was revisionism. New international economic order was revisionism. You wanted to revise this global world order which existed, which was dominated by the P5 or G7 or whatever. That revisionism continued. That came into question post 1998 because suddenly the question was, now as a nuclear weapon power, would you continue to talk of revisionism in terms of nuclear issues? Because that is where the debate between nuclear deterrence and nuclear disarmament comes in. Because now that you are a nuclear power, now you start to say that we are a responsible nuclear power, therefore Indo-US nuclear agreement is fine with us. Iran is not a responsible nuclear power, so therefore we will oppose Iranian nuclear things. We will oppose nuclear weapons anywhere else, basically because we are now sitting on the other side of the table. We are a nuclear weapon power. Further, look at G20. Revisionism. In G20 we talk of revisionism, therefore we want Africa as part of G20, which we succeeded. But in G20 we are saying now global south. And we still talk of revisionism because we are saying that, well, it is global south, and we do that even today. It is global south, we essentially want a place for ourselves in the world. And as an alternative, we talk of BRICS and expanding BRICS today. And you have a lot of articles coming in about how BRICS is going to create a very different governing image for these countries of the global south. Finally, strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy is something which we've been talking of earlier. It used to be called non-alignment earlier. What was non-alignment? It was strategic autonomy, but jargon is something which is American. Today you use the word strategic autonomy, basically you are saying the same thing. You talk of strategic partnerships, which is new. Earlier it was alliances. Strategic partnerships is something new. It is advantageous because you can become a partner of both Russians and the Americans at the same time. Because you are not saying this is our enemy, because you are saying basically you are going to be a partner for these A, B, C, D areas. You are going to be partnered with these countries for other areas. That is a new jargon, and we have accepted that. What is the central argument which we are now doing today in terms of our perceptions about strategic culture, our perceptions about how we project ourselves to the world? And that is the last issue which we have raised, sir. We continue to raise the whole idea that we are a civilization state and we have a civilizational perspective. That we look at ourselves not just as a nation state. Nation state we are, but we have a civilization state which goes back, history goes back to 4,000 or 5,000 years. That is our perception. And when we say we are a civilization state, what do we mean? We mean that India has a definite identity based on racial, cultural, linguistic, ethnic distinctness, born out of an assimilative culture and collective understanding of shared history, mythology, and traditions. That is what we are. This is not a religious form of reference. This is nothing to do with religion. This is something to do with the fact that we are talking of 5,000 years of history. We are talking of civilization. The labeling of Hinduism, etc., is much later. Second, we talk of mother of democracy now. We are creating a very different new narrative that we are a mother of democracy. It is interesting that if you read reply to the Constituent Assembly, in the Constituent Assembly debates, reply given by Dr. Ambedkar, and I'm quoting him, it is not that India did not know what is democracy. There was there was a time when India was studded with republics, even when they were monarchies. They were either limited or elected. They were never absolute. Buddhist Bhikshu Sangh practiced parliamentary procedures. They talked about a parliament. When we say we are the mother of democracies, that is what we go back to. That is what we quote. We say that Anglo-Saxon concept of democracy might be new, but our practice of democracy is ancient. It is these narratives that India would have to build, essentially in the context of what was being mentioned earlier, soft power. Our hard power is limited to South Asia, and we accept that. But our soft power is something which we can market, essentially marketing, in terms of what we are, and these two are critical issues today of marketing: civilizational state and mother of democracy. Let me make a final point and stop, sir. One of the debates in this context is human rights. Something which we have not been able to answer, and I've always stated this everywhere and written about it. Western perception of human rights places political and civil liberties and political and civil rights at the top in terms of the variety of aspects of human rights. Indian perception of human rights does not place political and civil rights and liberties at the top. It places food, shelter, clothing, education and health at the top. Other things come below that. Critical importance is that, unfortunately, Indian NGOs, Indian human rights organizations follow the Western model, I call it the amnesty model, follow the Western model. If you look at the Indian Constitution, if you read the Indian Constitutional Assembly debates, food, shelter, clothing, education and health are priorities, political and civil liberties and rights come later on. That is a narrative, that is a kind of an argument which we need to spread across and argue. That is how we look at human rights. Do not teach us what constitutes human rights from your perspective. Thank you, sir. I hope I've given the questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would very humbly request you, please do buy his book and read it. You will get much more insights into the whole strategic culture. And what I just want to add on to your discourse, you see, like we say, कुछ बात है कि हस्ती मिटती नहीं हमारी. There is something very unique about India and that we should be proud of. And what is that? That if you look at the entire civilizational journey of India, from a civilization state, we have, I think, very, I would say, steadily progressed into a nation state, right? Because there has been antiquity, which is still we preserved, and then there has been continuity, there has been experimentation, there has been adaptation, and then there has been modernity, all in one. And that is why, you know, we not changed much. You look at Chinese, I've been visiting China. There are many other civilizations that have perished or they've shrunk to almost unrecognizable kind of a state. Chinese, on the other hand, have gone through very, very turmoil periods of Mao Zedong had almost, you know, his cultural revolution was actually, everything was about, you know, dismantling the Chinese civilization. But it has actually revived because there is something which is very deeply etched in their collective psyche. But that is a debate by itself. And now we come to the next topic, and that is about Kautilya. We all know who Kautilya is, and she has written a wonderful book, and that is Strategic Cultural Roots of India's Contemporary Statecraft. That is in Kautilya's Arthashastra. And again, her book has got about 7 chapters. She's talked about Arthashastra's central paradigm and grand strategic preferences. Then she taken applicability of Arthashastra in Nehruvian foreign policy era, Shastri era, then Rajiv and Rao, and then she's come to Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh era, and then talked about Modi's foreign policy, and in our last chapter, she's tried to contextualize Arthashastra as far as India's grand strategic preferences and nuclear doctrine concerned. We know that, well, Kautilya had written on Chanakya Niti, which was mostly about code of conduct of a society, for most social code of conduct. And then Arthashastra was another book, and there is this Saptanga theory, the 7-limb theory of Kautilya, and then he essentially talked about, in the Arthashastra, was all about national wealth. How do you create national wealth and leverage that national wealth for the well-being of the your countrymen? And therefore the whole thing is, he talked about different elements of comprehensive national power. He talked about strategic configuration of that national power. And then he talked about interstate relations in terms of Mandla theory. Sam, Dam, Dan, Bhed, and all that, how this should be defined. So the question that I had discussed with Dr. Kamal was that, firstly I said, tell our audience a little bit about who Kautilya was and what is the essence of Arthashastra. Second, she's got a unique book, so what research methodology did she use to write this book? what is the relevance and applicability of Arthashastra in today's strategic environment? And unfortunately, Arth, even though Arthashastra and Kautilya is taught in National Law College, but its appeal in even within our own country is not to the desired level. So how should we create an appeal for Arthashastra and Kautilya's teachings? So with these few questions, over.
General Sharma, my very esteemed co-panelist, Professor Paranjpe, members of the audience, very good evening. A surprise has been sprung on me as well. So I did prepare a presentation before I had my chat with the DG yesterday, and we came upon these 4 questions which are not really converging with the slides that I made for the presentation. So I can actually go through the presentation and maybe take the 2 questions which are outside this presentation separately. So I'll first introduce the introductory question that is put to me is who was Kautilya and why is his treatise the Arthashastra important? What is the essence of Arthashastra? So I'd like to take that up first because I think that will provide a good backdrop for you to absorb the rest of the contents of my slides. But I would at the outset like to thank the Indian Military Heritage Festival for having me over here on this very, very distinguished stage to present to you my thoughts and insights on Kautilya. I'm also very, very glad that Professor Paranjpe has spoken before me because I'm more and more convinced about my gleaning of India's strategic culture from the Arthashastra because of several convergences that I found from his talk. And also, Europe has actually raised a lot of questions, which I guess I'll discuss with you later. So to begin with, no, these are not the slides yet. This is outside the slide, so don't move the slides till I tell you to. Now, it's a good question to begin with, who's Kautilya, but it's also unfortunately one of the more debated answers. So the debate on who Kautilya was, what is his Arthashastra about, the dating, authorship, the periodicity of the text, it's still being debated and discussed, right? But if you're looking at a intellectual, textual analysis of the Arthashastra rather than, a historical contextual one, then you would not bother so much about exactly which period and which era it was written. There are various schools of thought who think that differently. So there is one, if you follow the lead of the most credible translators of the text, which is R.P. Kangle, he would have us believe that Kautilya, Chanakya and Vishnugupta names of the same person. Kautilya comes from the Gotra to which he belonged. Gotra is clan, which is Kutal Gotra, and therefore Kautilya. Chanakya was his father, so derivative of that Chanakya, and Vishnugupta was his first name. We also believe that he wrote anywhere between 4th century BC to 3rd century CE because there's another school of thought which actually thinks that Arthashastra belongs to 2nd century CE. We do know that he was the first student at Takshila University, which happens to be in present-day Pakistan, the ruins of which, of course. But he also was the Prime Minister of Chandragupta Maurya, and the famous story that we know about Kautilya, that he chose Chandragupta Maurya and put him on the throne, and he had this very, very spat with Dhanananda, the last of the. It's all true, right? I mean, that's what we need to believe. Why is the Arthashastra important? And why did I choose to focus on Kautilya's Arthashastra as part of my endeavor to look at India's strategic culture instead of looking at this entire span that Professor Paranjpe just painted that canvas of, right? Why did I choose the Arthashastra? And I have 4 very important reasons to justify that. One, for the very first time, there existed this cohesive geocultural space with the desire to establish a pan-Indian empire in the subcontinent. It did not exist before this, and it was in this political context that the Arthashastra was written. So for the first time, modern empire became a virtually subcontinental empire. That's the first subcontinental empire this geocultural space has ever seen, and it is in this context that the Arthashastra was written, right? So you're looking at a certain territorial limit. Second, very importantly, the Arthashastra states this up front, that it's not a single Arthashastra, right? He says it's a compilation, and it's a compilation of a 200-year-old Artha tradition. So if you read Kautilya's Arthashastra, you'll see at various places he writes that previous Artha scholar Yatavyadi or previous Artha scholar Manu or previous Artha scholar says this, that this should be done in this particular strategic context, and sometimes he agrees with them and sometimes he differs. And wherever he diverges from what previous Artha scholars have said, he justifies it very logically. He says this is how the situation on the ground has changed, and this is why this precept needs to be adapted. And this is where the real essence lies. So he's not telling us to follow Kautilya's Arthashastra in toto as he's written it. In fact, he tells you that you should be the intelligent reader and figure out what is it in the Arthashastra which continues to be valid, and what is it that has become defunct, right? And that is exactly our approach to reading the Arthashastra. That's how we should be reading the Arthashastra. Third, very importantly, and this is why I think the Arthashastra is absolutely not comparable to a Sun Tzu or a Machiavelli, is because he talks about grand strategy like grand strategy has never been thought of 2,300 years ago. So the term grand strategy evolved from strategy, and if you go through Little Heart and all those works on grand strategy, you'll figure out that only by the 19th, 20th centuries these Western scholars came to know exactly what grand strategy meant. Whereas Kautilya talked of grand strategy without using the term grand strategy 2,300 years ago. And at the same time, he goes down right to the bottom of the ladder and talks about military tactics with as much great detail as Clausewitz does on war, right? So he covers the entire spectrum, and that's why I think this book is amazing. But the fourth point, and this to me is the most important, is that at this particular pivotal juncture where the modern empire was getting established, Kautilya's Arthashastra injects a very, very strong dose of pragmatism and reason to the scholarship on kingship which was evolving, right? From the Vedas to the epics to the Artha tradition, Dharma tradition, etc., etc. So what did the Arthashastra do? The Arthashastra told people about this political economic approach to statecraft. Now what is that political economic approach? I would need a slide here. Can someone help me please? So you can skip the first 3 slides and go up. Yeah, you can skip this as well. Yeah, that one next to this. Yes. So I would really take 2 minutes for this slide because I think this is important to understand the essence of the text. Now, this is the mechanism of statecraft, and this is all that you need to know about the Arthashastra. So here, very simply, the ruler is the Swami. So we know that we're talking about a monarchical form of government, and as Professor Paranjpe said, that the monarchy was not absolute, in the words of B.R. Ambedkar. So when we're talking about a monarchical form of government, he is as much referring to democracy because he's concerned about the welfare of the people ultimately. So this ruler is supposed to, in very simple terms, can you press the down arrow please? Acquire, protect, augment, consolidate land. And this is the real meaning of the term Artha in Arthashastra. People think it's economic, some people think it's wealth, some people think it's the Trivarg Artha Dharma Kam. Artha in Arthashastra actually means the land inhabited by human beings. So the ruler is supposed to provide this land, acquire this land, consolidate this land, and make it available to the people. Why? Because for people, the most important right for them, as pointed out before me, is roti, kapda, makan. Their physiological needs need to be met. They're not looking to vote here. They're not looking for freedom of speech here. They're looking for basic existence. And because this land is provided to them, next arrow please, they're able to provide their own livelihood. Why? Because 2,300 years ago, if you needed to gainfully produce, it had to come from land. Agriculture, cattle rearing, forest mining, anything that you wanted to gain, you needed to invest in land. Now when these people were provided with this land which was acquired by the king, the people were happy. This is Praja Ranjan. People will be happy only when they are given their roti, kapda, makan, the physiological needs. And when they are happy, what they end up doing, next arrow, is that they lend legitimacy back to the ruler. And that's how the monarchy gets its legitimacy, right? And in doing so, what they also do is end up paying taxes, because if there is a state managing all this, you need to maintain the state, and for that taxes are important. Next arrow, please. And that's how the kosh or the treasury gets built. And because there is a good treasury, there's an affluent, copious treasury, what happens as a fallout is that there is, next arrow, a very strengthened army. And because of this rod being strengthened, rod is the metaphor for use of force or dand. The symbol that we saw installed in the parliament is actually that, literally that, right? Now, because the dand is strengthened by the kosh, next arrow, the ruler is able to maintain Matsya Nyaya, which is the political anthropology of the text, which is in the absence of a central authority, the big fish will eat the small fish. He is able to curb Matsya Nyaya internally and able to wield the rod more effectively in the interstate realm. Why does he need to wield the rod more effectively in the interstate realm? Because he needs to protect his land. He needs to acquire more land, he needs to consolidate land, because only land can give livelihood to his people, and his people and their legitimacy is important for his existence. Right? So it's all a circle. And as a loop of all this activity, what ends up happening is, down arrow, again, is attainment of the end goal, which is yoga kshema. Now, yoga and kshema are twin words. Yoga, it's a combination word. Yoga means action, kshema means consolidation, and this is the political end goal stated in the Arthashastra. But what it essentially means is bringing about for your own people security, raksha, welfare, palan. And if you see, the security and welfare they actually feed into each other, and that's the biggest takeaway from this. That only when you have security can you provide welfare to your people. Only can you protect, consolidate land, can you give, welfare to your people. And only when people are well fed, their livelihoods are met, will they give taxes to the state, and therefore the state can provide more security. So it works in a loop. But also, very importantly, realism and idealism gets converged into one here. And this is the USP of the text. We had Suhasini in the previous session talk about interests versus values. The Arthashastra merges the two. That in showing your political interest, in pursuing political interest of a state, you're actually being ethical. Because in acquiring and augmenting, consolidating land, you're only helping your people become well fed. Right? So this really is the USP of the text. I can go on with my presentation, or if you want, you can pose the second question to me, however you would like to.
Yeah, no, I think because of the paucity, so I say, what research methodology did you use?
Okay. So I started my research 6 years back, and I was driven by this question whether India has a strategic culture or not. And one of the books that I read was, of course, Professor Paranjpe's. The literature at that given point in time when I started my investigation was highly cleaved. So there was a set of scholars at one end of the spectrum arguing vehemently that India does not have strategic culture, Tanham being one. And at the other end, we had a whole set of scholars who said that India does have a very vibrant strategic culture. And a whole set of scholars in the middle, Paranjpe sir belongs to that middle spectrum, where they talk about deliberate ambiguity, they talk about real the real politique, they talk about dualistic strand of Ashokan and Kautilyan. And so there was no definite answer to my question, one, whether India has a strategic culture or not, and two, what is India's strategic culture? I mean, if I were to ask you, I'm sure you would be, clueless about answers to both these questions, which is quite surprising because we are a civilization state. So, I chanced upon this book by Alistair and Johnston, who has done his investigation of Chinese strategic culture and followed a particular methodology. Now, Johnston is a quintessential third-generation strategic culture theorist. I'm not going to go into the theories of strategic culture, starting from first, second to third. But what struck me from his methodology was that he was looking at proving something. So researchability, quote unquote, was an important factor for him. He did see culture as an independent variable, and he saw behavior as a dependent variable, and he said that at the end of this exercise, you either have a strategic culture or you don't. Right? So I followed his lead, and his lead helped me get to the Arthashastra, because he said that you need to have objects of analysis. What is it that you need to investigate into to find out a country's strategic culture? So he said, let's look at the most ancient of texts that you have, which is available to the researcher, and from where you can derive certain grand strategic reference ranking. And for me as a scholar, I think the Arthashastra fit very well into his criteria for honing in on, object of analysis. So what he said was, and this is a three-step process. First, you take that particular book that you've, come to. You find out the central paradigm as Sir was saying. So the central paradigm essentially answers questions, provides answers to three questions, which is what is the role of war, what is the nature of adversity, and what is the utility of the use of force. And flowing from this ideational assumption, the grand strategic preference ranking, which could be accommodationist, defensive, offensive, right? And once you've figured out this strategic cultural framework from that ancient text, you go on to see whether it really reflects in the strategic decisions being made on the ground. And that is where I take in case studies where I look at India's relationship with the United States, India's relationship with China, Pakistan. And the third step is a confirmatory test where he says that if you've taken one strategic text of a particular time and space, you look at another text from another strategic time and space and see whether the grand strategic preference ranking perseveres to show the congruence, coherence, persistence. Right? And for that I take India's nuclear doctrine, both draft nuclear doctrine of 1999 and India's nuclear doctrine of 2003. So that's the process that I have followed in my book.
Thank you. I think it's very comprehensive. And now, very briefly, talk about this applicability and relevance today, particularly is Mandala theory really efficacious when we talk about multipolar world order and we talk about neighborhood first and whatnot, and with the kind of a communication today that is available in a globalized world. Your views on this?
Okay, thank you so much, sir. So I've prepared a set of answers for the applicability, and those are like 5 really key takeaways which continue to be relevant from the Arthashastra. But I think I'll stick to the slides here because they answer your question more precisely. Can you move on? The next one, please. So I'll take up exactly the Rajamandala and show to you how the Rajamandala theory is important, is relevant when we look at India and its neighborhood, when we look at India and its relations with the United States, and when we look at India and China. And that's all I may have time for. Now, if you go by the Rajamandala theory, I don't know if you all know, it's a set of concentric circles. That's the imagery that we have, the center of which is the Vijigishu, and then the concentric circles. There is this friend foe, so the territory immediately proximate to that of the Vijigishu is that of an enemy. The one next to the enemy is a friend, friend's friend, enemy's enemy is a friend. So this is what we know. But if you read the Arthashastra and if you read the nuances of this understanding of Rajamandala, you'll realize that not every neighbor is necessarily an enemy. That he does propose a whole gradation of neighborhood, that there can actually be neighbors who are friendly with you. And why would a neighbor want to be friendly with you? He may have a common axe to grind with a third neighbor. He may want your support logistically. He may just be a vassal state. So there are Bhritya Bhavins, Mitra Bhavins and Arya Bhavins as part of the Vijigishu's neighborhood, right? But more importantly, if you look at India and its neighborhood, then the neighbors become immediately, if you go by the Rajamandala theory, they become our Aris. But does it really make sense for India to make our neighbors our Aris? No. Why? Because we are ultimately focused on achieving Yogakshema, which is security and welfare for our people. And if we want security and welfare for our people, we know for a fact that India cannot prosper until the region prospers. And therefore this neighborhood first policy ultimately ends up achieving Yogakshema for ourselves, even if it does also for our neighbors. And that's why this term positive unilateralism. So we're not being foolishly benign here, we're being benign for a very realist reason. Because only when we contribute to our neighbors, only when we put in our efforts in terms of connectivity projects, of power, etc., people to people, only when we do that can we really have a more secure, a more prosperous neighborhood, and a more prosperous and secure neighborhood means a more prosperous and secure India, right? Next slide, please. The next one, yeah. If you look at India and the United States in India's Rajamandala is a quintessential Udasina. Udasina literally means a state which sits somewhere outside the Rajamandala. It's not exactly in the thick of things. It does it is much more powerful than the Vijaygishu, the Ali and the middle part put together. So if you consider India as the Vijaygishu and you consider, say, China as the Madhyam or the Middle King, if you consider Pakistan as the Ali, then the US becomes the Udasena, right? Now what India is trying to do with this Udasena is, and this is definitely post-2000, we've tried to make it a Mitra. Okay, now Professor Paranjpe talked about how we've always talked about alliances and partnerships as a new thing. Kautilya's Arthashastra talks about strategic partnerships somewhere. And he's very, very clear about how not to get into alliances, especially with powers stronger than you. So relative strength dictates the foreign policy actions that a country takes. And by Kautilyan wisdom, India should be partnering with the US, not allying with it. And why would India need to partner? So for maritime security, for bilateral trade, for convergence of interests as far as China is concerned. But what India is trying to do with the United States, as Kautilya would caution India to do, is not put all your eggs in one basket, diversify, also to hold your own strategic autonomy. So the text is very, very clear about internal balancing being preferred to external balancing. The ally which I'm mentioning to you is mentioned as the last of the 7 prakritis of the Saptangas that are mentioned to you. That is that you use the strategic partnership only when the first 6 internal state factors do not help you achieve your own national goals. So resort to the ally is last. Among all the foreign policy measures, the one which says that you can seek shelter from a more stronger power, which is samshray, is to be resorted to last, because the moment you seek shelter from someone, you obviously then making yourself vulnerable to be dictated to. So for all these reasons, India tried to make the United States its Mitra. But why would the bigger power, United States, want to be a friend with India? Because of strong convergences of interest. Right? There's a lot that the US is also gaining from India, and especially with respect to its position vis-a-vis China. Right? Next, please. Now, with China, it's it's very, very interesting. So it's followed the Kautilyan template throughout. Let's chart the India-China relationship from the 1990s. We entered with China into what Kautilya would call Samdhi, which is non-aggression pacts. The 1993, 1996, 2003, 2005 pacts were all pacts of non-aggression. And we did that. And why did India and China get into it? Because they didn't want to invest energies fighting each other on the border. They had just set themselves on the path of economic reforms. They wanted to, concentrate energies domestically. And it worked very well for both of them. It worked better for China than it did for India. Just keep pressing as I speak, because I think it's all dynamic. Yeah. So what happened exactly then, in the decade at the turn of the century, is that China rose asymmetrically higher than India. Both were able to consolidate their position, but China did it better than India did, right? And China rose to then become the Madhyam. And that's when India was faced with these options of, so there were convergences, divergences. I'm not going to go into the details, but we all know that this walking on 2 legs, which is ironically a Chinese proverb, is what India has always tried to do with China. But something changed post 2020. And that is what happened in the summer of LAC. And that's when China decided to walk out of the Pact of Non-Aggression. Now, why did China walk out of the Pact of Non-Aggression? Kautilya would say that the stronger power can walk out of the Pact of Non-Aggression only because it has 1, strategic advantage. 2, because the weaker power in the relationship refuses to remain the weaker power. We know for a fact that the Quad was resuscitated. We know for a fact the investment in border road infrastructure on the LAC. We know for a fact that India was trying to close this gap with China fervently in this decade, and perhaps that's the reason Kautilya would submit why China did what it did in the summer of LAC. And now the options that India has vis-a-vis China, as Kautilya would suggest, is to respond flexibly and to chart the whole spectrum between spineless submission to foolhardy valor. I know you're looking at me, sir, because I've run out of time, so that's all I have.
Thank you. I think very brief comments I'll request both of you to make. See, there is so much of wisdom in India. What should we do to promote our strategic culture and strategic thinking within our own country and outside? I'll request you also.
So, I'll suggest four things that can be done. The first three are serious academic suggestions. The last one is just. So the first is, of course, there is no alternative to continued graduated study, right? So you introduce the school children about, in terms of Kautilya. I have graduated from Delhi University doing history honors and then masters in international relations from JNU. And there's very little I know about Kautilya. I got to know about Kautilya only because I wanted to investigate into India's strategic culture. So this is how Kautilya is being taught. So we definitely need to make amends there. Two, I think we need to do certain collaboration. So there's a lot of research happening on Kautilya, but it's happening in silos. So there are defense and foreign policy think tanks, there are several other academic think tanks working in silos on Kautilya. There are various independent researchers and scholars who are working on Kautilya. So we need a kind of a theaterized approach to kind of bring all hands on one deck and to collaborate and to leverage from the work done by others, because there's really just so much to be read and done. The third, I think, is to not tell people about who Kautilya was or what is the Arthashastra about. I don't think you all are interested in that. We need to tell them how Kautilya is relevant today, right? So like China tells the people how Sun Tzu is relevant today, that's how we need to tell them how Kautilya is relevant today. We can't tell them that he was a Prime Minister of Chandragupta Maurya in the late, in 4th century BC. They're not interested in that. And the last is, which is on a lighter note, that if you're able to convince the Americans about the importance of Kautilya, I'm sure the Indians will do it. I mean, that's how yoga and Ayurveda has come back to us. So, if you tell them that the US Army War College teaches Kautilya, and if you tell them that we're actually supervising, I'm personally supervising a PhD thesis of a US Army colonel on India-US relationship in a Kautilyan framework, can you imagine the kind of interest the Americans have in Kautilya right now? And I know for a fact that Kautilya has always, for the last 2 decades, been taught in Germany, Russia, and China, along with the United States. So if we just popularize this, it'll get popularized on its own.
Yes.
That was correct. In fact, you'll find Peshwa Bajirao, the first campaigns are taught in the US, not in the Indian defense circles. But that apart, I agree with you that the whole perspective needs to be introduced right from the school level. One change which we did in Maharashtra, and I can talk only of Maharashtra basically because I was a chairperson for the Political Science and Defense Studies School Textbook Bureau. We introduced Defense Studies as a subject from 9th, 10th. We brought in workbooks and 11th and 12th. We also introduced national security and defense issues in the political science things. The idea is to get students interested in these subjects right from school. Nothing very dynamic, but the interest begins. And I remember when we first introduced 9th and 10th workbooks for the students, the government asked us how many books do you want to print. I said we don't know, because we don't know how many schools are going to start it. The initial print order was 5,000 books. Bombay Municipal Corporation, Mumbai Municipal Corporation introduced it. Within a month, they printed 5 lakh books, because that is the way it's spread. It is still spreading, but you start to introduce this concept right from there, it automatically generates. The other thing is, start looking at a variety of literature which comes from ancient India. It is a huge literature and it is a very rich literature. Kautilya is one. But start looking right from, as I said, Bhishma's advice to Yudhishthira or Sangam literature. Very little is known about Sangam literature. You look at all of that and try to understand that these are issues which were discussed there. do not look at ancient Indian literature simply within a narrow framework that वो तब हुआ था अभी उसको कोई नहीं have relevance precisely what you have done with Kautilya. Understand the relevance of that in modern times. I think the armed forces are doing that as a major exercise now. That is the second thing. Third, awareness about this in terms of Indian strategic culture at a political level, and I'm probably going into an area which might create some problems, but at a political level, across party lines, there needs to be an understanding that there are some issues where you do not use the word tolerant or intolerant in debates, or communal or secular in debates. There are some issues of national security which are necessarily national in character, and where there must be some kind of a cohesive perspective in terms of how you look at Indian strategic issues, Indian security issues or national security issues. That is where the political class needs to do it. I used to do it for some time in terms of inputs. Stop.
It's been very fascinating discussion. Any questions or observations you have, please request. Yes, sir. And then we'll request you and then that side. Yeah.
I'll be very brief. I've got a bad throat. I come from the Navy. The first thing we do on our ship, no religion. It's very, very important. I'm a regular visitor to China. The first time I took my wife to Shanghai, I'll be very brief. And we arrived, those of you who've been in Shanghai, and showed up Pudong. It's better than New York. Those who have not been to China will not believe me. And so I said, darling, aren't you impressed? She said, no. She's highly educated. I'm not. I'm senior Cambridge. So I said, what do you mean? You're not impressed? She said, why can't we do it? That got me thinking, and I wrote a book about it. But I would like to know from you intellectuals, and so beautifully, I've understood all this. USI has got, IDSA has done so much on Kautilya, I've stopped attending anymore of those. So my question is, China has no religion. Confucius, Sun Tzu, no religion at all. Has religion created confusion, or do you fit in religion to all this you told me?
Okay, that's one question. Yes, sir.
So this question about civilization, couple of questions about that, maybe some point to ponder over this. Firstly, civilization itself, the scope of civilization, further studies and excavations have revealed the area of civilization was much larger. Now it has come out now that it should have been better called, or should be better called, Indus-Saraswati culture civilization. That point not being so important now, but the area is much more than it was initially thought to be. And its impact shows its spread also, and it has certain other ramifications. Second, the point that came out that this cohesiveness of the civilization has a strong impact on nation state. I slightly beg to differ with this point. And so you also mentioned, कुछ बात है कि हस्ती मिटती नहीं हमारी. If the impact of the civilization was so strong and deep, the partition wouldn't have taken place. And after 1 year or so, or even lesser than that time, this doctor, I'm forgetting the name of this child, you may know just, Dr. Iqbal Muhammad, he wouldn't have said, सारे जहां से अच्छा पाकिस्तान हमारा, rather than saying हम बुलबुलें हैं इसकी, हिंदुस्तान हमारा. So, and secondly, the other side, I mean the Pakistan, who's the co-owner, equal shareholder of this civilization, has totally backed out and almost disowned it. So the impact of a civilization on the nation state is in my view, is a bit doubtful, basically. A third question is, then we say कि कुछ बात है कि हस्ती हिटती नहीं हमारी. It's okay as a शायराना ख्याला, but I think all civilizations within a time span of 500 years almost, Nile civilization, China civilization, Indus Valley civilization, Mesopotamian, they all are within the period of 500 and 600 years time span. They all have stood the test of time. They all have stood as much. Rather, they have sustained themselves over a longer period. Even if you take Mayan civilization, though it's of a later time period, it has also sustained itself and it's carried its value and its relevance still much more deeper in impact. Other point was coming back to the second point, Kautilya. Did we have a second? Firstly, we haven't spent much money and effort on this civilization. It's all been done in the West, obviously because we are not such a rich country. No, any comment, no, I mean, I don't mean showing any bias towards it, but it's still questionable whether at the same time or a little later, a parallel civilization on Indo-Gangetic basin developed or not developed. And Kautilya's impact of Kautilya and the time period on that of Indus civilization, how much seems very little to me. And third is this civilization, if you read, I am coming back to my previous point, there is a very good book or well-known book, Indus Saga. The author very quickly disconnects with the Indus Valley civilization, and he says that's why the period of this thing, what he calls it when you connect it to Indian this thing, nation state and all, he says after 400 to 700 years, there was hardly any nation state. That is historically, that he is not lying in that. But though he may be drawing a different set of deductions, inferences, that's okay. But historically, even after 2500 BC or little later, and particularly after AD period, 400 to 700 AD and thereafter, there has been no nation state for quite some time, more than 1000 years. So the impact of civilization over a nation state has been minimal. Historically, it proves the fact. And other points I have forgotten. I'll just leave it at that. And secondly, one more point. Thank you very much for taking this subject. It is very important nationally, and it is spoken or discussed or read so little otherwise in society. And what you said, you may have taken it up in Maharashtra, but there are many states, I won't like to quote names, where this won't be tolerated. State itself won't tolerate to give encouragement to this subject, but the way you have said it is being done in Maharashtra.
NCRT does not do it.
I didn't want to name the state.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you, sir.
please.
My question is to ma'am. Ma'am, you mentioned about Johnston, but Johnston did constrain his framework to post-1949 China. He was apprehensive about using this framework to post-1949. Maybe he had inhibitions regarding the post-colonial China, or there was a rise of modern nation state or communism. But you have gone ahead and taken a step and applied it to a post-colonial Indian society. I wanted to know more about it. What are your thoughts on this particular thing? And is there a possibility of evolution in the Johnstonian framework, the strategy culture?
Yeah, last question.
Thank you for taking my question. My question is directed towards ma'am. Ma'am, do you feel that Arthashastra is definitive in its original sense, or if we choose to abide by it in the future, will we need to add some changes to it with a twist of modernity? Thank you.
Give your contributing right.
Okay, so quite a few questions, and I would like to respond to some of the comments also, but I'll take up the question of religion first. So when you look at the Arthashastra and you read it, the ruler, who is this one, who is the most important person in this entire Ottoman state, is supposed to be trained in 4 sciences, right? And they are in order of importance. The first science that we ought to be trained in, and this is for the entire political leadership of independent India to listen to and take lessons from, is Anvikshiki, which is understood as the science of inquiry. So as a top leader, you're supposed to take the right decisions, and therefore your training should be in conditions of correct thinking and trying to understand the reality around you. So it's all about science and having a scientific temper. The standing statue of Chandragupta Maurya surviving today doesn't have him hold a very sharp weapon. He's actually holding a book in his hand. And in the other hand, he holds a gada which is pointed downwards. That look, I do have supreme executive powers, I have monopoly of the use of force, but I use it only when it's justified. And how does he understand what is justifiable and what is not? Because of his training of the mind. And those are the schools of Indian philosophy, again something that our children have been completely been aloof from. So if I told you that there was 6 orthodox schools of Indian philosophy and several heterodox schools of Indian philosophy which actually tell you how to understand reality around you, you would probably not even know. Samkhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, Vedanta, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, we've not even heard of them. So that's a very sorry state of affairs. But coming to your point, sir, the second science that you ought to be trained in is the Vedas. And the ruler's Raja Dharma, duty of kingship, is to have people follow the Varna Ashram Dharma. A lot of people then say that Kautilya was a Brahmin himself, and therefore he injected this so that the Varnashram Dharma was, and therefore there is a religious and orthodox Brahminism aspect to the Arthashastra. But because, and the other 2 sciences are economics and political science. So all the 4 sciences are important for the ruler to take the right decision. But Anvikshiki trumps the Vedas. Anvikshiki is seen as the lamp which shows the ruler what is good or bad in the Vedas, what is a good economic policy and what's a bad economic policy, and similarly for political science. So something in the Vedas could be transcended by the ruler if he thought that was important for the rule of the people. And therefore, in that sense, I don't like to use the term secular, so secular in quotes, the text is very, very secular, right? Having said that, there are elements of Brahminical orthodoxy, but I mean, come to think of it, we never wonder why Aristotle didn't abolish slavery. We never say that, right? Your point about Johnston and why did I choose post-independence period, whereas Johnston had not. So the reason Johnston gives to choose the Ming period as his empirical test period is because he found good resources. So he actually looked at the 7 military classics as his object of analysis, but the empirical period that he took up was Ming China, because Ming's response to the Mongols were invading them, he wanted to see Ming's response to the Mongols, and that was a good test period for him. For me, I looked at post-independence India only because of the geo-cultural political limit. So when the Mauryan Empire was established, it was the subcontinent that was under one political umbrella, and that subcontinent almost was under one political umbrella post-independence, and that is why I took that up. To answer your question, hello. So, and that's how I speak to my son as well. So, whether he talked about evolution, he did. So, there are various ways in which strategic culture impacts a particular nation state, and for Johnston, he says there are 5 ways in which it can impact. One is that there is a direct impact, one is there's a filtered impact. He also accounts for evolution in strategic culture. So he says with the change in material environment, the strategic culture may change, but it will lack the change in the objective material environment. Right? So he does account for evolution. In fact, Kautilya himself accounts for evolution, because he says that not everything that I've written here will be eternally valid. You need to vet it for yourself whether it's relevant today or not. So you need to have a scientific temper to read the Arthashastra. Right? So I hope that.
Would you like to comment on this civilization and the state?
Let me comment on China first. It is more of, you might say it an anecdote, but let me comment on it. This is an experience which I had in the US, Washington DC, when the State Department official was taking us around. We were all Fulbright scholars. There was a Chinese professor with me, senior Chinese professor, and the State Department official was showing us various buildings. They have brass plates there, and saying this is where what Madison used to stay, or this is what some person used to say, this is 300 years old, this is so many years old. And every time he would say that, the Chinese professor would smile and give a nod. This irritated the State Department official. And when we had a break, we three were sitting together, and then he asked him, why are you so skeptical every time I was saying this is 300 years old building, this is 200 years old building, and we put a brass plate. The Chinese answered, he said, look, my house is 100 years old. We don't put a brass plate. My country is 5,000 years old. You are only 300 years old. Then he turned to me. He said he comes from India. His history is equally 5,000 years old. He said, we remember our history with pride. We carry it with grace. He remembers his history only on 15th of August and 26th of January. That is a tragedy. That is an answer to your...
Did we go to the conference in South Africa together on Indian culture?
I think so. Stellenbosch?
Yes.
Yes, correct.
You and I went.
Yes.
You have grown big. Huh?
I know.
We went together, Indian, huge conference, very
This
big
is
conference.
Stellenbosch conference on
Thank you.
about civilization. About civilization, let me put it this way. Again, let me give school textbook examples. We teach Indian history to our students. And I have actually counted lines of Maharashtra textbooks from 5th standard to the 10th standard. 70% of the history taught is north of Narmada or north of Kaveri. It does not include Sri Lanka, it does not include Assam,
Yes,
it does not include.
south of India is not.
Yeah. And rest of it is, Cholas, Pandyas, Satvans, all of them is.
Possible.
Naturally, when we are talking about Indian civilization, we are talking only of the Indo-Gangetic, Hindustan, not Deccan, not South. Naturally, our whole perspective of civilization is going to be what is popularly called mainstream India, which is Hindi heartland. We changed that in the history textbooks in Maharashtra. We were criticized for that severely, that we have given up all that Mughal period, etc. We said, no, we have balanced it. We brought in Ahom, we brought in Jammu and Kashmir history was taught only from the 13th century onwards, even in the NCERT. And Jammu and Kashmir has a very glorious history of Buddhist, Hindu, and Sikh empires. We brought all of that. We were criticized very severely, but that apart. That is where whole civilization perspective comes in. We tend to talk only about Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. We do not talk about the Tamil and Keralite civilizations, which are as ancient, as prosperous. That is a problem when we talk of civilization. Pakistan, nation state and civilization. This is something which I've had a long interaction with some of the Pakistani scholars. Their argument is very simple. They said the moment you say civilization context and how similar we are in terms of culture, the question of our separate identities ends. Unless you say that we are two nation states, independent nation states, we will not be able to interact with each other. The moment you say we are two civilizations, kuch farak nahi hum mein, then why are we separate? Pakistani perception of it is very clear. For them, their identity in terms of their civilization as an Islamic state starts with the Mughal period, where the Mughal period was from what? Afghanistan to Burma and from Kashmir to this thing. Their argument is in 1947, what split was India, what remained was Pakistan. Lahore is the cultural capital of Pakistan. Islamabad, Lahore is the cultural capital of Pakistan. Once you look at it from that point of view, you will have to understand why India and Pakistan have talked to each other as nation states, not civil. Same with Bangladesh, same with Nepal, same with Bhutan. The moment you talk that you are one civilization, the legitimacy for a separate state ends. That is where the whole argument has to be made. Unified state, what you say is very true. Unified state, it was the Mauryan Ashokan time when the state was unified in terms of this thing, critically administration. The only other time you have a unified state is the Mughal period, up to Aurangzeb, perhaps. Yeah, the center was strong and this. Sometimes you might say Maratha Confederacy, but it was a confederacy, it was not a unified state. And then you have the British. So that concept of a unified state is only this time. And the moment you say unified state, you go to nation state, not civilization. And that debate has always taken place. Nehru, Discovery of India, 2 chapters, one after another. Mother India and that unity in diversity. Mother India talks of a civilization perspective, unity in diversity talks about a nation state perspective. Both coexist in India, and they have to coexist in India to this thing. Last point in the stop, the parliament fresco which is there, the new fresco, about which there was a lot of debate. It is not a nation state, it is a civilization perspective that India is trying to project.
I think I wish we had more time to discuss this, particularly civilization state and the nation state. But wherever we go, and people do respect India for an ancient civilization, and there's a lot of lure and appeal for India and respect for India's civilization state. And I think after going through some periods of upheaval, we've been able to preserve whatever our old customs, traditions, very much vis-a-vis many other countries. And I can tell you about Chinese, though their hands, 95% of them are hands, they speak one language, Mandarin, but yet there are problems there even within China. And there is also, I was in Tibet for about a week in 2019. There is also a little bit of an identity crisis of what is their religion. Taoism, Confucianism, all this is very, very abstract. And most of them, in their subconscious minds, actually relate much better to Buddhism, right, than Taoism and Confucianism. But at the end of the day, I think what is missing in India is that we are not doing adequate to study our evolution of our strategic culture. And enough is not being done to promote and distill and crystallize our ancient culture and promote it to the rest of the world. And this is the thing that this work must begin, this debate must begin. And very rightly, both the panelists have said it should begin from the school level. And that temperament for your socio-cultural studies, your civil studies, your sense of history, sense of geography is extremely important. And I think on that note, we hope that some of the people who are sitting here, maybe there would be better sense will prevail, and we would be able to not only have a better sense of pride about our civilization and our culture, but also propagate this as part of our soft power and image building across the globe. Thank you very much. It was very nice to interact and to listen to our most enlightened speakers. And please join me in giving them a good applause.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, with this we come to an end of day 1 of Indian Military Heritage Festival.